Jon Summers is the motoring historian. He was a company car thrashing technology sales rep that turned into a fairly inept sports bike rider. Hailing from California, he collects cars and bikes built with plenty of cheap and fast, and not much reliable. On his show, he gets together with various co hosts to talk about new and old cars, driving, motorbikes, motor racing, and motoring travel.
Good day, good morning, good afternoon. It is Jon Summers, the motoring historian, and today I have with us Eric, producer guy, and William Ross, Ferrari guy. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it.
And you listeners there, you've only been listening to this for about 30 seconds, but these gentlemen have, as usual with Mark Gammy, they've suffered through half an hour of me yelling and shouting and cursing at technology because I can't make the recording work. So in the future, when podcasting technology works as smoothly, you'll have forgotten, the world will have forgotten about the challenges those of us have with the podcasting equivalent of Model T Fords and crank handles and all of that. So look, I wanted to do something slightly different with this format today. I've tried to do a pivot to talk in a slightly more serious way than historically I've done on these pods with Mark Gammy, and that's why I wanted to have Eric and William on this time. The occasion of our pod today is to talk about 30 years since the passing of Ayrton Senna.
May he rest in peace.
Yeah, I wonder if he does rest in peace. That's the question, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
In life, it didn't seem as if he would. And perhaps that's really what we've got to be thinking about here. And what my sort of reflection on Senna's been is that Alan Henry, who's a journalist that I don't particularly rate, but he wrote a book about Senna called As Time Goes By. And I think what's interesting about that title is it hints at the fact that our ideas about somebody like Senna change as time goes by. And I feel like that's been the case for society at large with Senna and even for myself as a Senna fan. And I really was a Senna fan in periods. So look, Eric, I know you're fond of this, and the young'uns are fond of this kind of question, aren't they? Who was their greatest of all time? And I've tried to put together a little agenda for us here to allow us to examine that question in kind of a sensible way. I'll talk a little bit about the work that I've done in the past, sort of thinking about this. Really, it started with me being like, I was obsessed by him as a boy. Well, what was the who, why, what, when of that? And I wanted to grow into that a little more. So,
and what's important about that, John, is, as I like to say, even on Break Fix, is we're all petrol heads of a certain age. We grew up with Senna, and Senna shaped our view of the motorsports world, maybe in different ways. Maybe it was his triumphs at Monaco. Maybe it was those very long promotional ads he did with Acura, when he's out there in the loafers on Suzuka, debuting the brand new NSX. He just had this charisma about him. And I think it affected people in different ways, but all of us are from that era of racing. And so looking back, 30 years since he passed away. I mean, he would have been, what, 60 some years old this year?
Yeah, 64 or 65. I think it was 64 that he was born in, wasn't it? He was 34 or 32. He's the same age as Jesus was when he died. I always think that's there's this sort of, and it's a little bit like that very cynical LA movie producer said when James Dean was killed, that, it's, you've like great career move. You've like died young and left a good looking corpse.
So, William, what about you? I mean, Ayrton left a mark on you too during his time with us.
Yes and no. I appreciate his skill, his talent. That's when you really started getting into just, hey, that's all those guys race was F1. I want to say Senna was more of a bully than, anything. He forced his way to the front. Yeah, he could drive a car. There's no doubt about that. But I think it's kind of one of those, I don't know. I think his ego got in the way a lot of times in regards to it.
And he may or may have not allegedly tried to take out Alain Prost more than once, but we'll talk about that later. But you bring up something really important because I can draw a parallel, and I'm sure John will get to this later, between Max Verstappen and Ayrton Senna, because the parallel there is you can take the boy out of the go-kart, but it's very hard to take the kart racer out of the boy. And if you watch Senna, he grew up karting, and John, I'm sure you'll cover this, private go-kart tracks at his house in Brazil and all this kind of thing. And kart racing has a certain sort of racecraft to it that if you take that to its logical conclusion in Formula racing, he continued that same driving style. He drove his McLaren MP4 like it was a go-kart. I mean, people make that it drives like a go-kart. Well, Senna drove it like it was a go-kart. And so you see that in his racecraft, you see that in his aggression, in that bullying, as you call it. And so I grew up noticing that too. And like you, I respected him. We put Senna on a pedestal, but there were other characters in the shadows. There were the Damon Hills and the Nigel Mansells and the Alain Prost and the Michael Schumachers that learned from Senna. And so we'll get into all that. And John, I don't want to put the cart too before the horse because this is your show. So let's begin at the beginning.
No, I love your, we've used this word bullying, haven't we? You asked William for his opinion, and he prevaricates and he hesitates a little bit, and we get the same kind of response as we might get from an old NASCAR fan, somebody who maybe wasn't a Dale Earnhardt fan in period and is now asked to reflect on Dale Earnhardt. And I think that's a really useful sort of parallel to think about is that both of them sort of died in period and I maybe weren't that well loved or had some tactics that were a bit questionable. And that, as you say, it changed the sport. It put them on a pedestal and we've got bully and we've got charismatic. And this is sort of what we're picking around at with Senna in general. And I think, I'll say it now and we can come to it later on in the show as we talk on as well. But I think greatness, my thinking about Senna has led me to think that greatness lies not in the number of accomplishments you have, but how you do the accomplishment. So in other words, when we think about Prost and Senna, it's not about statistics, it's about how they did it. When we think about Muhammad Ali, it is a charisma, but it's not he was a handsome guy and all the girls liked him. It's something more than that. And it's a good place to start with Senna, right? Because for me, there was nobody loved motorsport in my family. And, Formula One just happened to be on the TV on a Sunday afternoon. And I watched it, and it was a small TV and it was color, but it was small. And the cars droned and the volume was low. And I was eating barbecue at a friend's house. And I watched the JPS Lotus be in front, and I liked the guy in the yellow helmet driving it. There was something about that reached out of the TV, out of the helmet and out of the car and through the TV and, thousands of miles and gripped me. And I think Senna had that. And I feel like that's what we respond to when we talk about, the greatest ever. Now, this business of the comparison with Verstappen and Carter's, I think this is a valid comparison. This is something I want to talk about with Senna is that Senna is at almost the end of the epic era of motorsport, and it was like gladiatorial and the beginning of this sort of PlayStation, WWE, like wrestling, it's all for the show kind of way of being with Formula One. And, we can talk about that more later on, but certainly before the era of Senna and Prost, there was no requirement. Not everybody came from go-karting. James Hunt didn't come from go-karting. Niki Lauda didn't come from go-karting. Mike Hawthorne would have laughed at you if he told you needed to drive one of those ridiculous little things before you could drive a proper racing car. So, but arguably, of course, those little rear-engined racing cars that the guys like Sterling Moss started off in Coopers and so on with the little V-twin motorcycle engines, those kind of cars were pretty similar to go-karts. So arguably, Formula One always had this kind of go-kart heritage, but certainly Senna is the beginning of that era where if you didn't come from karting, you're really going to struggle. And if you're going to drive Formula One, you aren't messing around going to Le Mans. at the weekend. You're not like, oh, I'm going off to Indy this week. I might just win Indy and then come back and do Formula One, like Graham Hill or Andretti. If Ferrari called him, he'd call Penske and say, hey, I'm not racing for you this weekend. Got to go to Monza and win the Italian Grand Prix for that old man Ferrari, wouldn't he? That wasn't around by the 80s, right? And that does play into the greatness conversation, because I think a measure of greatness is breadth, right? And Senna arguably didn't show that kind of breadth. But let's talk about that later on. Let's frame Senna as you asked me to there, a little bit about background and history. So yes, Brazilian, and yes, wealthy, and not just wealthy, but also, mum and dad cared. So, the karting didn't come easy, but when it came, there was the money to do the karting, and there was the money to do the karting properly. And it was all about whether or not you hurt yourself, not whether or not you blew the motor up on the kart. And that might seem obvious, and that might seem normal for how modern racing drivers do it. But that was not the path for Bruce McLaren. That was not the path for NASCAR drivers. It was often all about the shoestring, or for Fangio even, it was much more of a hard scrabble kind of existence there. So Senna comes to England in late 70s, early 80s. And this is because England is perceived from where he is in South America, in Brazil, as the center of motorsport. And that's an interesting thing, and it plays into Senna's career, because you've got the FIA based in Paris, and you've got all the teams who were all based within about 150 miles of Oxford, which is a nice university town, which itself is only about 200 miles just west of London there. So you've got this sort of British mafia in Formula One, what Ferrari called the Garagista teams, the Tyrrells and the McLarens and the Williamses. These are British teams run by British people who are using the Ford V8, which is all right, an American engine, but it's built in England. And, you get the Hewland gearboxes from Maidenhead, which is on the way from Heathrow. When you land at Heathrow, Maidenhead is on the way out to, wherever your base is at Didcot or Woking or whichever team you're with at the time. And there's a definite sense, I think, that by the end of the 70s, the French in the FIA were like, F this, right? Away with these 3.5 litre V8, and we're going to go to these turbo motors. And so this is sitting at the back of this, isn't there? Because Renault comes, and the best driver that Renault is able to produce is Prost, isn't it? And he was the first French world champion, which is really a remarkable thing, given they invented motorsport. The first French Grand Prix was in bloody 1906, and it took them that long. They couldn't get a world champion together. So maybe you can argue, no wonder Balestre and the Frenchman running the FIA at the time wanted to change. Anyway, long and short was, this was the lie of the land. Everything was in England. Just Senna came to England. And in the movie, he talks about racing with this guy, Terry Fullerton, in go-karting. As an Englishman, what the media picked up on was when he first did Formula 3, and I think it was the 1983 British Formula 3 season. He and Brundle, it was him and Martin Brundle, hammer and tongs, and Brundle beat him. And it's classic Senna, right? That Senna did the histrionics where there was contact and, did all the coming from behind. But however you may feel about Martin Brundle now, and I know he's more famous for his clownish grid walks with Machine Gun Kelly now than the driver that he once was. But for a lot of Englishmen, certainly for me, if I were ever to see him and shake his hand, I would still be shaking hands with, in my opinion, the only person who ever legitimately beat Senna. Nobody else ever beat Senna in the same car, but not before or since, than Brundle that year in Formula 3. He had a wife. Did you know that, gents? He came with, I think her name was Adrienne.
What?
She didn't speak much English, I don't think.
Didn't he date music sensation Shusha for a while? There was like a whole thing going on with the two of them?
Oh, but this was later. He married when he was quite young. And they came to, and she was like 19 and he was 21 or something like that. And I'm not sure if you've ever spoken to South Americans when they've like relocated to Seattle. Manchester, if you speak to Spaniards or Italians who are living in like Scotland or something like that, they really struggle with the weather. the weather is really hard. It's the dreary grey days. Even people in California who have grown up outside of San Francisco is these sort of grey months in the end of the summer. And I don't notice it because I'm English, and my friend from Cleveland, he doesn't notice it either because, Cleveland's like that too. But if you're not used to it, it's really hard. And I think she struggled with that. I think she struggled with the focus on racing. I think she struggled living in a house with the boys, because Senna lived in a house with, do you remember Mauricio Gugelmin?
Oh, yeah.
I think after Formula One, he was one of these people who was better than his Formula One career gave him credit for. And didn't he wash up in IndyCar? Didn't he do IndyCar for a bit?
Yeah, he didn't do too bad in IndyCar. He won a few times there, but yeah, he actually, I think more known for IndyCar than he was his F1 career.
Yeah, so he and Senna were mates. And the other guy that was here that really put in a good word for Senna was a guy called Johnny Cicotto, who was a Brazilian he'd done motorcycles, and he did like big rig racing when big rig racing was big in the 80s as well. But he was somebody who I think had the ear of the British motorsport community a little bit and put in a good word for Senna, and the drives did the same. But yeah, I think fundamentally, so as the relationship struggle really early on, I feel like you see Senna's commitment, right? Faced with, go home to Brazil and make sure the marriage works or do the racing. Well, he stayed and she went home.
He chose the racing.
Yeah.
Right choice.
So it's funny. I was talking with an American guy who's not really a car guy earlier today, but he was talking about IROC Camaros, and I remember I realized just what a special place this, all different drivers all driving the same car, international racer champions, just what kind of cachet that had. In Europe, they would do similar of these kind of one mark races. I think if you Google it up, there's like the Formula One drivers all racing Austin Metros around Silverstone somewhere, which is basically like
the Beetle Cup series.
Yeah.
Well, Mercedes, I believe it was Mercedes, organized an event, and Eric, you may know this. Was it at the Nordschleife or was it at the Südschleife? I don't even know exactly where.
Yeah, it was what would be considered now the Nürburgring GP course. I've actually watched this more than once. There was when they were debuting the new Cosworth-powered 190 2.3 liter 16 valve, which wasn't even the Evo or the Evo 2 yet. So Mercedes was launching their new 190E. And so, yeah, they did basically an IROC between all sorts of, already famous names of the time. And what I take away, spoiler alert, from this race is, if I remember correctly, Senna didn't win. And you said, he doesn't get often beaten by people, but he got beaten by Hans Stuck, which doesn't surprise me at all.
I thought Lauda won that series, didn't he?
Overall, yes, I believe he did, because he was racing in that too. But in a particular race, the one at the Nürburgring GP track, Hans Stuck took home the trophy for that. I could be wrong. I've watched it a couple of times. I'm a huge Hans Stuck fan as well. So to me, to see Senna in that IROC, that was pretty awesome.
I always feel like a lot of the other people in the race didn't take it that seriously, and I feel like Senna took it as a serious opportunity to put his name on the map. And he was almost too serious at that time, because the car is a great car, right? The car was Mercedes' version of the E30 M3. So it was like the little sedan with 2.5 liter inline six, but it had like a dog leg 5-speed.
Yeah, I had one. I beat the hell out of it. It was a fun car.
Well, that was the problem with them, right? Was that everybody who ever had them did that to them.
Yeah.
Slight correction for homologation purposes. It was a 2.3 liter 4-cylinder 16 valve.
Yeah.
And then it went to 2.5.
In the United States,
Yeah.
the street car was a 2.5 liter 6, but the actual homologated street cars were 4 cylinders, because so was the E30 M3, because they planned to use the 190 in rally, and they did use it in rally.
Wow, Eric. Wow, you're a veritable...
Did I know something that you didn't know?
You're a veritable Wikipedia. Yeah, wow. So with Senna, right, the real, everything that we talked about so far is like the prologue to the race career, right? This like status of the GOAT or not, is the nub of the question we're talking about. Really, like chapter 1 would be that year that he spent in 1984 with Toleman. Now, I went to Goodwood a couple of years ago, and I have a mate who goes quite regularly, and I guess they've got a Toleman, whether it was the one that Senna had or not, but they have a Toleman. I think the model is the TG184. It has a really bizarre, like double wing, like a double element rear spoiler, where the second element sort of goes over the engine cover. So the car looks weird, at Goodwood, I remember that like midway through the year, he was still using last year's car. And this is also the era where it's like 4 cylinders and it's got a massive turbo on it. And you've got like a knob, basically like an oven controller just under the steering wheel. And you just turn the boost up with that. And I run a class at Stanford every year. And, you know, in preparing for that, I found a Mario Andretti quote about those cars from that turbo era. And he said, you know, the power was not benign power. I need you to think about if somebody like Mario Andretti, who can drive an 850 horsepower sprint car on dirt, like with his eyes closed, if he's talking about the power not being benign power, I think you really get a sense of just how horrible to drive those cars were. Now, old Piquet, Nelson Piquet is always good for a quote, isn't he? He described the Monaco Grand Prix as like riding a bicycle around your living room. If you do the computer games, you kind of get a sense of just how tight it is. And of course, Monaco is one of the places where Senna's skill really demonstrate, you know, where Senna really demonstrated the difference between him and your average bear in terms of that ability to get closer to the barrier and brake later and do it over and over and over and over and over again for 3 hours.
Because it comes from kart tracks. It's very similar. It's very parallel to his experience. So him standing basically alone from a lot of the other drivers that didn't come up through karting, he was in his element at a place like Monaco.
Just like in a kart race too, when he crashed out leading the race by God knows how what, and he went back to his flat in Monaco to go pout instead of going back to the pits, just like a kid racing karts.
So that race was the gap there. That whole incident, right? I vividly remember it. I don't know. I must have been. It was 88, wasn't it? So it was the spring of 88. So I would have been 14, nearly 15. And by that time, like thoroughly committed. Like my Sunday mornings, where I would get out of bed, I would look at the newspaper. And you knew in the newspaper, if he was on pole, he could win. And if he wasn't on pole, you know, he wasn't, you know, he was going to struggle. In the McLaren year, it was different. But if Prost was on pole, he was going to struggle. Well, I remember looking and thinking, is that a misprint? Because he was a second and a half faster than Prost. When they were like, and then it was only like a minute and a half around the track. It was like Prost had missed a gear in comparison. And in the race, he just drove off at the front and did the same thing. If we want to get into not whether or not Senna was the greatest ever, but if we really want to get into Senna's greatness, it was right there, because the gap between him and everybody else was so enormous. And the skill involved, the cars were hard to drive, and the skill involved was arguably greater than. So if Senna's greatness is anywhere, it lies in the performance gap between him and anybody else, right? So that year at Monaco, he was way faster than everybody else. He went faster and faster and faster. They radioed him to slow down. It broke his concentration. He put it in the barrier. And understandably, I had no problem with him going back to the barrier. Like, what is it? It's not like I'm not like some NASCAR guy thanking my sponsor, you know, and thanks to, you know, whatever dog food that's sponsoring me, and thanks to my mum in the garage, and thanks to my dad for patting me on the back when I was 5 years old, and thanks to God above. No, right? No, I'm pissed off. I made a mistake. I did it in front of everybody else. And I don't need to talk to Honda. I don't need to talk to Ron Dennis. And I certainly don't need to talk to any newspaper wankers about what just happened. Oh, Ayrton, can you tell us what happened? Oh, yeah. A plane crashed out of the sky and it just disturbed me. And you know, because of that, I jinked to the left. Oh, I lost concentration and put it in the barrier, idiot. Anybody could see that, right? Anybody could see that. The person who emerged from that room never made that mistake again. Never overdrove again. Never. Right. From then on, the gap between him and everybody else, he never overstepped it. And in the wet, it was so obvious, and it was so obvious at Monaco, because we just talked about 88 being the learning moment. 4 years before, 84 is the year that he's with Toleman. It rains. Prost wants the race to stop because it's raining, which is understandable, you know, slick tires and all, and he's leading and all.
He's pulling the Niki Lauda thing.
Yeah.
It's all good.
Senna is coming with the thunder and actually passes him on the finishing line, thinks he's won. But because, you know, the event is the rules of the game are that if you stop the race early, it always winds back to the way the result was on the previous lap. Of course, Prost was leading then. So he's the winner.
Yeah.
And I think if it's on YouTube, you can see what Senna's thinking on the podium with Prince Rainier, right? You can see what Senna's thinking there. There's already a sense of the narrative that appears in the movie of this, bloody French stitching me up. I'm sure back in Woking, I'm sure Ron Dennett and the English mechanics didn't say to him, bloody French stitching you up. I'm sure none of that. I'm sure all those people at Honda in Swindon, just down the road from Woking, I'm sure none of them went, bloody French stitching you up. Right? I'm sure none of that happened. I wasn't aware of that in period.
Are we saying that then is the moment? That is the event horizon for the beginning of the Prost-Senna rivalry, which continued for years.
No, it was there all along because Prost was the guy to beat. Once Piquet was no longer really in the frame. And I really wonder how seriously Senna ever took Piquet, because Piquet's so seriously overlooked. I need to do a thing right and think and write properly about Piquet. But if you go back to 81, 82, 83, people like Gordon Murray, and I've no reason to doubt him, people like Bernie Ecclestone considered Piquet the very best guy. So what happened, right? Because by the late 80s, he wasn't there. Well, if you look at recent interviews with Piquet, they'll say that he had that huge prang at the beginning of 1987. At Tamburello, right? The same accident Berger had, the same accident that would kill Senna. Piquet had that accident and he was never the same again. He reckoned he didn't see the same way afterwards. So that year, 1987, remember, where he was at Williams.
Right.
And remember, famously, he called Nigel Mansell's wife ugly. The reason he did that was, I've seen him there's an interview that he did at Goodwood just recently with Rob Widows. It's out there on YouTube somewhere, where Widows asks him which championship he was most proud of. And he says 1987, because I wasn't fast anymore. I'd lost my eyesight and I realized the only advantage I had against Mansell was in testing. So I knew that I had to split up the briefing. I couldn't sit in the same driver briefing because then I'd give up my advantage. So that was why I started doing things like saying his wife was ugly, because I wanted him to, but he wouldn't hit me. It was so English. Like, I wanted him to try and hit me, and then we'd definitely be split up, and then our briefings would be separate. And then I could have the settings, which would be enough to enable me to have the competitive advantage, which, so, and Piquet did win the championship that year. But if you look, he rarely, in those later years, he rarely outdrove other people. It was usually the car and a well-judged race. Those early years, I feel he was really good. I don't know how he compared with Senna in those early years, but for me, Senna always wanted to beat Prost, but I dare say that was because Prost had the best car in those years, that when Senna was in the sport and really focused. It was, if you think Prost was the dominant driver, 84, 85, 86, and those were the years that Senna had moved from just trying to get to Formula One to being in Formula One and really thinking, what's it going to take for me to achieve my goal here?
So to bring our listeners up to speed, so we're sitting in the middle 80s. We're talking 84 to 87 right now. Senna moves from Toleman to Lotus. And then...
Yeah, and I would just say, Eric, one more thing on that Toleman years and on that Monaco Grand Prix. And I should say the Toleman caught fire, blew up, unreliable, just crappy, not competitive for the rest of the year, right? So it's that much. But arguably, Stefan Beloff had an even better race than Senna in that Monaco Grand Prix. And if you look at Beloff's other achievements, we're having a conversation, who was the greatest ever? If you really want to stat rat it, Beloff's 1984 was arguably more stellar than Senna.
At the same time, since we're going to focus more on the rivalry between Prost and Senna, Prost is running for Renault at this time. He has not made the transition to Ferrari yet, right?
To McLaren.
No.
Yeah, to McLaren.
Well, Senna to McLaren and Prost to Ferrari.
Yeah, McLaren, then Ferrari.
Right? They both step up their game and go with major manufacturers in 88.
Yes. So Prost is with McLaren he leaves Renault in, I think, 83, and by 84 is at McLaren with Lauda's champion. 85 he's at McLaren, 80, and right the way through until Senna joins in 88, and then they have the year where it's really mano a mano in 88. I was going to say 85 is the year that Senna steps from a second-rate team to really a team where you can feel like you can challenge for the championship. And this is when he joins Lotus. And again, within the British press, there's a lot of contention around the joining of Lotus, because he said, I'll join Lotus, but I don't want Derek Warwick in the other car. Now, you may or may not know Derek Warwick. I mean, he runs a chain of Honda dealerships now, but he was one of these roughy, tufty, Mark Blundell kind of working class, not, James Hunt. Dad was a stockbroker kind of guy, working class guys who were really, Warwick could have been a Formula One world champion. If you look at Warwick's performance in Arrows, had the cards fallen differently, he could have been a Formula One world champion. Right. And recognizing that, Senna said to Lotus, you can only build one fucking car for the race that's actually going to finish. So you're building it for me. I'm not having you building it, half the good bits on Warwick car and half the good bits on mine, and then we both don't finish. Like, you're putting a rabbit in the other car and I'm driving the car that you can actually build properly. And to his credit, Peter Waugh, the boss of Lotus, was like, okay. So the other guy, the rabbit, was this guy, Johnny Dumfries. Google him. He was one of England's richest men. He owned a castle in Scotland, which he sold. He was a philanthropist, beautiful daughter. He's a rat hole worth falling down. To be like I was Ayrton Senna's teammate was just part of the coolness of the Marquis of Dunfermline, I think was his name. John Dumfries is anyway. So Dumfries was the teammate that Senna had at Lotus, right? This is the year that Renault are doing Lotus engines. And although the Lotus chassis wasn't great, the engine made all the power. I just want to pause a little bit. We talk about these turbo engines and we say, 1,500 horsepower, 1,300 horsepower. I don't know what you guys had read. My understanding is the BMW 4, not V6, made 1,500 horsepower once on a flash reading. Senna, in this era, in a qualifying spec motor, could expect 1,300 horsepower. But that engine is only going to last the out lap, the fast lap, and the in lap. It's done then. And when we move away from qualifying engines, which we do in this period, we don't get that. So what Senna got in race trim, and what Senna got in race trim with the boost down versus what he got in race trim with the boost up is TBD. Total aside, well, not total aside, but relevant angle. I read an interview with Patrick Tournbay quite recently where he was talking about the Ferrari 126C and how he was saying this is an earlier turbo car, like early 80s turbo car. He reckoned that you never knew what power you were going to get from 1 minute to another because they hadn't even figured out the metering. In other words, you could go around one corner and the turbo would blow a lot, and you could go around the other way, I put the G-forces the other way, and it would not blow as much. So all of these horsepower figures are completely like variable, but that's the amount of horsepower he was dealing with at that time. And they're wide tires, wide slick, but relative to the aero on modern cars, not much aero, not very aero complicated. I guess the other thing that's very noticeable for us when we look at cars like, Senna's 97 and 98T, that was the models there, is your ankles, your feet and ankles are in front of the front axle line.
Right.
That means if there's an accident, there is a little bit of plastic, the brake master cylinder and your feet against the barrier, which is why, those 80s drivers now, they all walk with a bit of a limp. You'll see Brundle on his grid walk, he walks with a bit of a limp because all of them have broken their ankles and feet multiple times.
So going back to these horsepower numbers, so I'm leaning a little bit on my VW, Porsche, Audi knowledge. And in 87, the McLaren MP4/3, the predecessor to the infamous Senna's MP44, was powered by the TAG Porsche V6. And I remember seeing those cars at the 87 Monaco Grand Prix and all the things we're talking about. In the Porsche books, those Formula One cars were rated at 850 horsepower. I didn't think they were making
race trim. I would say that was race trim.
Right. But I never saw numbers above 1,000 in the Porsche world. So I would say if we use that as a benchmark, at that time, Formula One had become more of like spec racing like it is today. They had to fit within a certain horsepower window. So in race trim, they were all somewhere probably between 830 and 870 on race day. Sub 1,000 horsepower.
No. You had a knob. There was a gas limit. You had a certain amount of gas.
Yeah.
So if you turn the wick right up and had it making 1,000 horsepower, you'd pass everybody and then run out of gas.
That was old school DRS.
Well, okay, right. But what kind of racing is it? Like, is this Formula One? when you're losing the race because you're running out of gas, or, you know, in order to pass, I'm like turning up the boost. You see, directly relevant for Senna, because those early years with Lotus, those races that I watched at the barbecue at Simon Leake was the lad's. Now, his dad had a Saab Turbo, a Saab 900 Turbo, which I can A973 BMJ. I still remember the number plate now, isn't that crazy? Those races, right, Senna would piss off at front and then would break down or run out of gas. And there was talk in the British press at the time that he was just showboating. You know, he didn't. And of course, he was hugely insulted by that. And I was thinking about that earlier today, that completely misunderstood who Senna was as a person. That was a poltroonish move, and Senna was nothing, not a poltroon.
Before we move on just a little bit, so I'm coming to the table with a little Porsche knowledge, so I want to lean on William a little bit. Do you remember, horsepower wise, some of the power figures of what the Ferrari Formula cars were putting down at that time, just for comparative purposes?
As John mentioned, I mean, they all had, you know, back then they were 30 engine, 40 engine years, because they would just qualify motor, pitch it. You know, it wasn't even like they rebuilt it. They got rid of it. But, you know, they could crank that up for it. But I know back then it was about 850 in that range, give or take 10, 12. That the biggest trick was, especially during the turbos, one, obviously mileage-wise, but is how the power came on. Because, you know, you had the guys going, okay, coming in the apex. I haven't hit the apex yet, but I'm putting my foot to the floor, because by the time I hit the apex coming out, that's when the turbo kicks in. So it's all about moderating and be able to know and handle the horsepower. And like John was saying, it was so erratic, it was kind of hard to have that flow going to it. So, you know, that's great. But I parameter wise, whatnot, I know they're all in that 850 range. Doing it.
And what you described is what I've also heard from talking to several 935 drivers, where mitigating the turbo lag was the biggest thing they had to do, because it would kick them in the chest when it was on boost. And after that, they were just dogs. So they had to really keep them just strung up as much as they could to stay in the boost range, and then made the cars really twitchy, made it hard to drive, and they're just monsters to begin with. So I can see that translating to Formula One. But 88, for me, as we transition into this, I know John wants to go here because it's a special year. It's that potpourri, it's that mixed bag of Formula One that I want us to go back to, because we sort of ditched the turbos, but there were still some turbos around. And then you saw the V12 Ferrari return. You had, you know, the MP44 Honda engine. You had all these different just awesome cars running together, and sort of the end of the turbo era that had started in the 70s, right, John?
Yeah, they wound the boost down. So I think 87, Senna, 86 is the last JPS car, and he finished fourth that year, fourth the year after. The Lotus that he had in 87 the model was the 100T. It was Camel sponsored, and the chassis wasn't up to scratch. The interesting thing about that car was active ride. And by that year, you know, Senna won the street races, and if it was wet, you know, that was it. So anywhere where there weren't those two parameters, he wasn't winning. So it was really exciting for me when he went to McLaren at last, because that was a good, you know, they were considered the best team at the time. And of course, what you weren't expecting was that car turned out to be arguably the greatest Formula One car ever. I mean, certainly a completely dominant season. And it is worth drilling into that, right? That there were 16 races, and that McLaren won 15 of them. And the only one it didn't win was the Italian Grand Prix at Monza, which took place 2 weeks after old man Ferrari died. So it was the first Grand Prix after the old man died. I don't know what happened to Prost in the race. I need to look it up and see what happened to him in the race. But Senna was out in front doing his like aggressive passing of back markers, and a guy called Jean-Louis Schlesser, a sports car driver who was subbing in the Williams, didn't see him coming, turned into him. Senna got airborne in the first chicane, crashed out of the race, and the Ferraris were second and third and went on and won. And it was all super poetic, and McLaren's perfect copy book that year was blotted. I guess the thought about that year was quite early on. It was clear how much better the car was. So it developed into this duel between Senna and Prost. And certainly by the time of Monaco, it was clear that when Senna won, Prost finished second. But if Prost won, Senna struggled to finish second. He tended to not finish second, or just generally have some other, you know, Senna-esque kind of histrionics that was nowadays there's so much emphasis on winning, completing every race, and you get penalized so much in the points if you don't finish. But in those days, it wasn't really like that. And to illustrate that, Prost got far more points through the season, right? But in those years, there were 16 races, but you could only count your best 11 results towards the championship. So early on, it became clear that it wasn't about acquiring points. It was about winning every weekend. And that I absolutely love.
Let's pull on a thread here, though, because there's some really important other things that are happening in the world of motorsport and especially in the automotive world. And this leans back into Williams' camp when we talk about Ferrari. 1988 signifies a very important time in Ferrari, right, William? August 14, 1988 is the day Enzo Ferrari died. The last car he blessed was the F40 and the Ferrari 640, which would be the next year's Formula One car. Those are sort of the last two cars. I don't want to say he was directly involved in the F40 for sure. This is a pivotal moment for Ferrari. They're getting their asses handed to them by McLaren with a Japanese engine from Honda. And their answer is the Ferrari 640 with a V12. Going back to Enzo's original methodology, big engine, big power, the hell with the rest of it.
Well, for 89, they banned turbos.
Yeah.
That's right way it goes. So in 88, you still had teams running some, some had turbos, some were running Cosworths, all that kind of stuff. It was kind of across the board.
But they didn't develop that engine overnight. It was already being planned.
No. And kind of going back to that one winning 2 weeks after, you go really in deeply in that. Some people kind of say it was all rigged just because of that. It was Enzo had passed and there was all this colluding going on and whatnot, saying, oh, we have to have Ferrari win, at least coming first, 1-2, which no, but it's one of those situations where it's just kind of, that storybook thing is like, oh, it's too good to be true.
Senna was so aggressive with the passing of back markers, right? When it happened, I remember being mad, but also feeling like, well, it had to happen sooner or later. Even at the end, right? Even his passing at the end, it was he who lives by the sword will surely die by the sword.
Yeah, exactly. And going into 89, though, going through, obviously, turbos are gone. And that's when you had V8s, V10s, the Ferrari with the V12. The biggest Achilles heel they were saying about that was weight. That's what the biggest kind of problem was with that car, just because the weight that motor added. But the diversity that you had, where Formula One was going in regards to the cars, what they're able to do, and just, development-wise, where everything was going it was such a great time in regards to that. I mean, from your late 80s into your mid 90s was just awesome. And then what they were doing with McLaren and everything like that with the cars. I mean, they were epic cars. They're some of the best F1 and arguably, my opinion, some of the best looking F1 cars ever built. I mean, just gorgeous.
And what's funny is if you compare those cars to the ones of today, I've made the joke, and it's not too far off, that the wheelbase of a current F1 car is the same as a Ford F-150. They're absolutely huge at 140 plus inches wheelbase. If you look at Senna's MP44, which was at Car Week at Pebble Beach last year, where John and I were together, to use the phrase again, it's like a go-kart. It's tiny. And to your point from earlier, John, I believe it was Tanner Faust actually drove that car. I don't know why it was him, but he drove that car and talked about it a couple of years ago. And he goes, I don't understand how they drove these things. It's impossible to drive, and to drive at the limit. He couldn't fathom doing what Senna did.
And on this theme of greatness, and we're going to touch on this later on, but that is the thing, isn't it? That motorsport is about leaning out of a high window. It's who can lean the furthest out of the high window without actually falling, right? And greatness is about who can do that out of the highest window, and these cars were very high window. They were hard to drive properly. And the other thing is, although we're talking about Monza, the circuits are the same, that the runoff was very different, and some of the circuits they used were very different. There were super unsafe throwback circuits in place of a lot of the more a lot of the circuits now that are very modern and safe and sanitized. I guess the aero, we talked about after Senna, one of the things after Senna's passing was that they moved the front axle line back. And, we were talking about the world of Porsche. That's the difference between a Porsche 956 and a Porsche 962 is where the axle line is. I feel like modern cars, they're just so much more aerodynamically complicated. Their aerodynamics were less sophisticated then. So, that MP4/4, it has the adjustable elements on the front wing and the adjustable elements on the rear wing. And the side pods are just the side pods. There's no aero or anything to do with that. The wings are the wings, whereas a modern car, your sense is the whole car is part of the wing there. I think the other thing to think about is the turbo technology was going out, and the way that the turbos went out was first they limited it to 4 bar, and then they limited to 2.5 bar of pressure. And even in the 2.5, I think 89 was the 2.5 bar year, and the McLaren was still a super dominant. Of course, the Garagista teams, you then have to pivot somewhere else, right? Are Honda going to build us a V8 or a V12? Are we going to have to go somewhere else? And a lot of the teams, as William said, they went back to the DFEs, the Ford DFEs that they'd been using back in the 1970s before the turbo era. And for the time that the normally aspirated cars and the turbo cars ran together, the turbo cars were just in a class of their own. They were just much, much faster. If you wanted to win, you needed a turbo car. What I was going to say, what came along in the background, right? That's why I wanted to mention that Camel Lotus 100T that Senna had in 87. By the early 90s, by 92, Williams, Nigel Mansell at that time, had got the active ride thing completely right. They'd also got traction control right. They'd also got semi-automatic gearboxes right. So by 92, we'd almost already moved into that point and squirt kind of era that we're in at the moment, where, if you look at film of Senna, I think on YouTube, there's Senna on board. He's like pole lap at Monaco in 1991, and he's taken his hand off the steering wheel to shift. And you're like, well, obviously he would, but if you show modern Formula One fans that, it's quite astonishing that he goes through Casino Square with only one hand on the steering wheel.
Oh yeah. And they say lap of the gods, as it's titled.
Yep.
That's where the respect comes in. Those guys, is to your point, is especially going on somewhere like Monaco, you're driving with one hand because you're shifting so much.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember what the number is. They said how many times you shifted during a race, and it was some obscene number. Not only just shifting, but heel toe and doing your feet. I mean, you have all your appendages are doing something different. It's not like something's doing in unison like this steering.
It's like being a drummer.
I'm braking, I'm hitting heel toe, gas, and clutch, and all this stuff. And that's where the respect comes in. And you see them today, and like I said, you start getting the early 90s, some automatic gearbox, everything like that, and you start getting a lot of the controls on the steering wheel in regards to stuff moving around. Hey, your brake bias, and all about the active aero, and all about the active suspension and everything like that. And those guys go where they could change it for every corner and all this stuff. I mean, it was just getting, I would say, out of hand, but basically that's what it was, is because it was who had, again, it's all about money, but who had the best engineers build what they could create, because there really wasn't any limitation on it. A lot of guys adapted, some didn't. It just really kind of changed how you looked, how someone raced a car, and had the guys that were transitioning through it, and Senna obviously didn't miss a beat. His limitation going from that, from the McLaren into the Williams, the only thing was his McLaren's, the engine would let them down in regards to those last few years he was there. He still did all right, but it came down to the car.
Well, so that's the thing, isn't it?
And there you go, because he wanted to have the winning car, but then he goes into the Williams. It was such a cool time in regards to what was going on.
Am I the only one that when Senna left McLaren, despite, let's say, the dismal failure of the V10 Honda engine versus the turbo V6 that it replaced, I was disappointed. I felt like Senna had somehow thrown in the white flag. Like, going to Williams, for me as a fan, it felt like defeat.
No, he tested with Williams at the beginning. He always had the relationship with Frank Williams and Patrick Head. There was always an open door there. So there was always the recognition. And remember, Didcot is not really a long way from Woking. The engineers cross-pollinated. So that English Garagista club, right? And for that last year at McLaren, that 1993 at McLaren, because 91 hadn't been 93 at McLaren, the car wasn't there. Well, 92 wasn't great, right? So 93, the car wasn't there, and he did individual races. He did an individual race-by-race contract with Ron Dennis. They would negotiate before every race because the car wasn't there. Because Flavio Briatore, the Benetton guy, had negotiated a deal with Ford that they always got the latest spec engine. So Senna was stuck on a non-spec engine. And again, right, we're talking about greatness. The 1993 European Grand Prix from Donington, and we should say it was the only Formula One Grand Prix from Donington in the post-war period, right? The previous one was like in the 1930s when it was the Silver Arrows. That race where Senna is starts fairly low down the grid and then just drives past everybody else like they're standing still on that first corner, down through the crane of curves. This is arguably the greatest opening lap in history, and definitely is a demonstration of Senna's just superior skill when the grip conditions were super questionable. So, without that year where he was hyper pissed off and arguing with Ron Dennis all the time and on a month-to-month, on a race-to-race contract, it gave us that Donington Grand Prix. It squeezed that brilliance out of him. Although I would say Hakkinen out-qualified him. Hakkinen's first Grand Prix, he out-qualified Senna. And it was pure speed. Again, right, you rarely see Senna bested, certainly qualifying, but you did there.
As a little side note, who his teammate was for the first part of the year, a little gentleman by the name of Michael Andretti.
Yeah, that's right.
93.
Yeah,
that's right. I will never forget that Australian Grand Prix when Michael, his first race. What a letdown. Oh my God.
Yeah. And Hakkinen took over, I think it was after the fifth race, sixth race, something like that.
I remember it was at Estoril. I remember he out-qualified because Senna's first Grand Prix victory in 85 had been at Estoril. And I remember just being rocking on my heel that Senna had actually been out-qualified. Because again, the greatness thing, right? He may not have been the greatest all-rounder. I think you'd struggle to make that case. But was he the fastest ever? If you look at the pole records, I mean, how long did it take Hamilton to eclipse his pole records? A really long time. The starts to poles ratio that Senna had was unequaled. The stories that journalists tell of, because he used to get an hour to go out and do qualifying, any time that you set within that time, you'd have the qualifying tire and the qualifying motor, so you'd only have the 3 laps. But what Senna would do was wait until the very last minute, so he was the last person out, and then you would know exactly the time that you had to do it. He could always eke out that extra difference. Now Michael Schumacher could do it as well, and it's become, as qualifying formats have changed, it's become part of a Grand Prix driver's anatomy. Years before, they didn't do that. A guy like Fangio would spend 3 days working up to that pole time, just like you see the Isle of Man TT guys doing that now. Whereas, after Senna, Michael Schumacher famously, Martin Brundle used to say, you'd spend all week at Silverstone testing. Fucking Michael would turn up, second lap would be faster than anything you'd done all week. And you'd just be like, what? Like, how can I match that?
And you bring up a good point that Schumacher at this point is in the shadows. So we have to remember that too. And he's studying, the rain god, as they used to refer to Senna. And Schumacher himself was very talented in bad weather and sketchy weather conditions. But going back to my point from before, I, as a fan, we're talking about putting Senna up on a pedestal. We're paying tribute to his life. We're talking about his career, all this kind of thing. I, as a fan, when I saw him put on that Williams uniform for the first time and race, I was like brokenhearted. I felt like he had given up. Like he was the Marlboro man, right? He was McLaren. He was that Honda, that car in him. I don't think about Senna with the Lotus. I think about Alex Zanardi as one of the last John Player special drivers, right? And that kind of thing coming up at the same time as Senna and all this kind of thing. I put the two together, the brand, the car, the time. Senna is McLaren. McLaren is Senna. When he put on that Williams uniform for the last year, it did something to me, and it makes me wonder, and I'm going to check my conspiracy theories at the door, that had he not gone to Williams, had he not been impatient, had he let the development team continue to maybe refine the V10, work the bugs out of it, it was whatever, development process like happens today, maybe, just maybe, Senna wouldn't have ended the way he did at Tamburello. And we'll talk about more.
I have to say, and Lego agree with you too, because
100%, man.
The model you got right behind you.
The car everybody aligns with Senna is that MP44.
And speaking of going to Williams, I kind of agree. Obviously, making the decision to go to Williams was based on the car, and he felt that Williams was put him in the best position. But the problem was when he went into it in '94, they took all his regulations and they got rid of the active suspension and that stuff. So there's a big drop in regards to how much an advantage the Williams had.
It wasn't just that, was it? If you think of it, Williams, since 1991, Williams had had a car that did everything with computers, and then they were banned. So Williams had to go back 3 years, whereas the other guys, they didn't have active ride in the first place. So they still had a pretty good chassis. So Senna had spent all year telling Ron Dennis, no, I'm not committing to you, telling Patrick Head and Frank Williams, I'll drive for you for free. Now he's finally got the car. The car was bloody terrible. The car was virtually undrivable. And the race at Interlagos, the Brazilian Grand Prix in 1994, he had a half spin. He'd not had a half spin. I'd not seen him had a half spin since the Lotus years, right? So those early years of 1994, when it was clear that the regulations had really left him high and dry. And let's be clear, right? With the benefit of hindsight, it is like I think it's beyond debate that Flavio Briatore and Michael Schumacher were cheating. They were cheating with the fuel rigs. We remember Jos Verstappen's caught fire in Brazil. It was because they cheated the fuel rig and there was too much fuel going into it. They were also cheating around traction control. So Senna was unfairly beaten in those first three races. And this is why we have this bad feeling around Williams. If there hadn't have been just not the cheatiness, if there just hadn't have been the cheatiness, there would have been a sense of equal terms. So as we arrive at Imola in 1994, Senna wouldn't have had that pressure cooker of the requirement to perform. The failure is not an option. Of course, the business of who's to blame, if we accept the Italian court's argument that the cause of the incident was the broken steering column, yeah, if he hadn't driven a Williams, he would still be alive, wouldn't he, Eric?
Again, I'm not going to put on my tinfoil hat, but
I just want to say, I think that steering column story is a load of absolute bollocks.
I'm glad you said it.
If you just pause and really stop and think about that, you're telling me that a Williams mechanic, not some fucking 16-year-old straight out of college, a Williams Grand Prix mechanic is not able to weld steering column together sufficiently well that after 4 whole laps at racing speed over the rough bumps of Imola, 4 whole laps, this steering column shears in half so completely.
Yeah.
That's a load of. So you have to, but let's be real about this, right? If it wasn't the steering column, I think what happened is that there were bumps on the inside of Tamburello. And I think that at the start of the race, somebody, Leto, I think, stalls and somebody runs into the back of him. Horrible accident at the start, wheel going everywhere. There's debris. New process. Safety car comes out. Safety car is a Vauxhall Vectra GSI. Now, I never had the GSI model because it had a lofty 170 horsepower. And my company had a policy that you weren't allowed more than 150. I had to make do with 130 horsepower SRI. The bottom line is this is a fucking slow car to be leading a Formula One race. And the thought is that the tire pressures in Senna's car went down. And you can even, he complains about, you can see him gesticulating to the safety car driver to, go faster. So I think the tire pressures went down. I think the car rode lower. And as for the bumps on the inside of Tamburello, Senna is on record as saying to Damon Hill, his young teammate, is bumping on the inside of Tamburello to stay off there. Now, if you look at the onboard with Michael Schumacher, and this is just the Senna thing, right? This is maybe my idea about Senna, but if you look at the onboard, having told Hill stay off the inside at Tamburello, having gone and spoken with Ratzenberger's family, having gone to Barrichello's bedside, having done that, he then puts the car right on the inside because there's no way I'm losing this race. I've got to win this one. I've got to prove myself. I think that's what happened.
I'm going to say one word. I'm going to say sabotage, because that is sometimes heard on the winds of this conversation that the car was in a very soap opera-esque way. Maybe the brakes were manipulated. Maybe the steering was manipulated with. Maybe the car just, let's call it was sabotaged. I think Senna, in some ways, and maybe I'm speculating here, was a bit of a hypocrite. Damon, I don't want you on the inside of Tamburello because that's going to give you my line, right? Because that is an old racer's trick. Never tell them, never show them your actual running line.
No, the young Senna might have done that, but look at the way that Senna was in those. It took Hamilton Hamilton achieved maturity far more quickly than Senna, right? Senna, it took, or the other way around. I feel like Senna achieved maturity more quickly than Hamilton. It took Hamilton a while to sort of come out from under the shadow of dating the pop star and stop being managed by his dad. It took him a while to stop being a boy and start being a man. And you could say what you like about him now. I know my friends at home think he's an idiot. I like the fact that he's doing different things outside of the sport and he's experimenting with the notion of what a Formula One champion can be. Senna, there was so much self-confidence there after those 2 or 3 world championships. That was why he was happy to banter backwards and forwards with Ron Dennis for that 1 year. And that's why the fire was there to do that stellar lap at Donington. That's why the fire was there to race this young German whippersnapper, right? He was, because that's the great loss, right? That you mentioned Schumacher was there waiting in the wings. I don't feel that he was. He was there at that Belgian Grand Prix the year before. He never really got the only races they ever really raced against each other were those early years, were those early races of 1994. When, as I've said, I feel like Briatore was putting his thumb on the scales in Senna's favour. So look, we've talked for ages. Let's at least move the conversation a little bit towards whether or not we think he's the greatest ever and how we might begin to answer that question. So the first thing I want to sort of shoot down is this myth that people always say, which is, you can't compare people across eras. And I agree. Trying to compare Rudolf Caracciola with Nelson Piquet, both really good, neither anybody's greatest ever. Well, maybe Caracciola was, I don't know. But what I'm saying is if you pick, not Richard Petty or David Pearson, if you pick Bobby Allison, or if you pick Cale Yarborough, and you try and pitch them against Gerhard Berger, or if you try and pitch them against, Pietro Bordino from the 1920s.
It's apples and chainsaws.
Yeah. But fundamentally, I put it to you, Maldonado versus Buck Baker, easy. I put it to you, Rossemeyer versus Nicolas Mazepin, easy, right? That you can always tell the greats and you can always tell the terrible people who should have bloody stayed at home.
I think in this case, to your point, we have to boil it down. If we just focus our attention on the era at hand, let's say the period of 1980 through, let's take it all the way to 2000, just to be fair. So a 20-year span. There's 3 names we have to look at. The Bergers and the Jean Alesi's and the Nigel Mansells and all them, okay, fine. But there's really 3 names we have to focus on here. And it has to do with statistics, like you mentioned at the beginning. So it's going to be Ayrton Senna, Alain Prost, and Michael Schumacher. And I want to bring Schumacher into the conversation because I think when we talk about modern Formula One, as you're alluding to, it comes down to, even though Prost, even as of last month, has been standing up and saying, hey, don't forget about me. I won more championships than Senna did, blah, 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 blah. Okay, great. All of that is true on the back of the baseball card. Prost has more wins than Senna. Is he greater than Senna? My answer to that is, like, to your point, very simple. No. Is he one of the greatest rivalries? Is he a villain or vilified in Formula One? Absolutely. There's got to be a bad guy. But to William's point from the beginning of the conversation, who was the villain? Was it actually Senna as the bully, if you think about him with that lens, and Prost as the martyr? Or is it the other way around, right? So it's a rivalry, fine. But again, I mentioned earlier, Schumacher is in the shadows this entire time, and using your math, which is greatness over time, it becomes a question about Senna versus Schumacher.
I've sort of 4 criteria that I feel you should apply. I feel that the first one is, like, how dominant were they and for how long? So clearly, somebody like Valentino Rossi, who was really fast for a really long time, we can say that person's impressive. And you might want to think about, there's some guys in American oval track racing who've been really dominant for a really long time. John Force in drag racing, right, the other one that I thought of. The other thing is I think a lot of greatness lies in the ability to be cross-discipline. So Sterling Moss's greatness, if you went to a British club race in the early 50s, there would be 10 different races with 10 different kinds of cars, and Moss would often be entered in every race, and he would step from a rear engine 500cc Formula 3 car into a Jaguar touring car into a Formula 1 car and win everything I feel like that skill, I feel Andretti had that. I feel like
Yeah.
Foyt had that a lot. I feel like that is a level of greatness. And again, by that measure, Senna.
Does that transcend though? Because we're talking about the greatest in Formula One. And to your point, Senna never really did any other disciplines. He came up through the ranks, right? Go-karting to Formula Ford and Formula 3 and to Formula One, but he never ran other than that Mercedes race that we know of. He didn't do touring car. He didn't do rally. He didn't come to the States and do the Indy 500 like Jim Clark did, right? Or things like that. We begin to close the aperture and we're really talking about the greatest in Formula One.
And this is poor Verstappen, right?
Right.
How can Verstappen demonstrate greatness when he's only allowed to drive the best Formula One car, and when he's driving the best Formula One car around circuits designed by Hermann Tilke?
Right.
You know, you can demonstrate greatness at the Nürburgring. You can't if you're on a Tilke circuit in the same way, right? You can demonstrate some greatness, but it's hard.
Let's be fair. Verstappen's going to be fast probably in anything you put him in. We've had this discussion before. He hasn't proven himself yet. He hasn't stepped out of his comfort zone, which is Formula One. And so that's where, again, I draw that parallel 40 years later between Verstappen and Senna. Is Verstappen the new Senna? If you kind of think about it, looking and comparing their story. But then who's the Schumacher? I guess that's Lewis Hamilton of that generation.
Yeah, except Hamilton feels far more like Senna reborn.
Yeah,
For somebody like myself, Hamilton's whole way of being, the whole way that Hamilton raced felt like, spiritually, it felt the same, right? Senna did everything with passion. Michael did everything with clinical coldness. I was a Michael fan in period, but only because he was so much faster than everybody else, right?
Yeah.
And so for a minute there, Hakkinen could touch him. And I think, but for most of the time, he couldn't, right? The competition wasn't there. And I think that's another measure of greatness that you know, Senna did have these awesome foils. So you talked about Prost as one foil. I think Piquet's another. I think Nigel Mansell's another. And there is that photograph of the four of them sitting on a pit lane wall somewhere. Each of them were talented in their own particular way. You know, Prost with the completeness, Nigel Mansell with the willingness to race, and Senna with just the raw speed and aggression. Of those, is he the greatest? I think so.
Yeah.
Of those four. For Prost, the whole business of hero or villain, you know, in period, Senna was definitely the villain. People didn't like him in period. He was the villain in period. And Prost was the established star who drove in a clean way. You know, he was le professeur, wasn't he? He reasoned everything, which if you think of it, that's how drivers have evolved before. But if you think of how different le professeur was from, you know, Sex, the Breakfast of Champions, and, you know, that was good enough to win Grand Prix just a few years earlier. So Piquet, as I say, Piquet, that early period with the speed, those Brabham years, I didn't watch those years. I really wonder. For me, Piquet's hidden just how fast he maybe was.
Right.
But actually, wheel to wheel, Nigel Mansell raced like nobody else. But the reason that Nigel Mansell always raced like that was there was always some Birmingham-esque tragedy that he would moan and drone on about in the pit conf, and you were always just like, you know, and it's as simple as the reason the dude always had to drive out of his skin was because he bollocks up qualifying. Like any normal driver would have qualified well, had the car at the front and just pissed off at the front. And then there wouldn't have needed to be all the, you know, Il Leone, the lion, you know, histrionics fighting your way through the field. Now, for all that, Nigel Mansell is a great Formula One driver, but, you know, not in the same breath as Senna or Prost, in my opinion. Now, I don't believe in statistics, don't really care about the statistics. To me, it's all the way in which it's done. So the fact that Prost has 4 championships and Senna has 3, so what kind of thing.
Yeah.
Is Prost right to feel a little aggrieved now? Yeah, because Senna's taken on this sort of James Dean like glow, right? And this is something that, you know, is worth talking about a little bit, is the work that I've done around Senna, where in 2004 I was living in Italy, so I drove to Imola to, you know, do a personal, like, how is this with Senna? Because it was so important for me. You know, my crash helmet was a Senna replica, and there was nothing there. There was nothing there and nobody there. Then I went in 2014. I was about to be a dad, so it was an important time in my life. And then at Imola, there were events. There was photography exhibition where they'd done a sort of Andy Warhol pop art version of Senna. The Google Doodle, when you go to the Google landing page to do your search thing, there's a little picture around it. The Google Doodle was of Senna. He crossed over into the realm of something, of something more than that. And what that led me to do was, as I thought more about that, was to develop this idea that we've talked about before, Eric, of a sort of beatification, that he's moved from being, a racing driver to being a saint. I don't mean it literally. I don't mean, he's now St. Ayrton.
Are you sure? Because in Brazil, he might be.
Well, all right. But it's this pivot from, it's more like Elvis or Marilyn Monroe, that you move from being an actual pissing, shitting human being to being like an icon of the 1950s or the king of rock and roll. And so Senna has sort of moved towards this sort of the handsome dead racing driver. And maybe I'm exaggerating that a little bit, because I feel like, 30 years on, am I still talking about Senna? I am.
We are right now
for an hour,
But to your point, and I think it's important because it's that martyrdom status. He's been put up on a pedestal because he was taken from us at an early age, like a James Dean. That's a great analogy here, because we don't know at 32, 33, 34 years old what he could have done to today. I do feel for Alain Prost at this point, because he's standing here going, guys, I'm from this era. There's not many of us left, of that time period. What about me?
You feel for Alain Prost. What about Martin Brundle?
I know.
What about Martin Brundle? Brundle beat it.
Brundle
was the man who beat Senna. 191 Grand Prix starts, 0 wins, and now a clown show with Machine Gun Kelly and Shaquille O'Neal, who doesn't even know who he is.
Right. But my point is, had Senna not died, I don't think we would be having this same conversation. The GOAT, the greatest of all time, would unfortunately be Michael Schumacher. And we know we're not really sure his health and status right now either. There's, a lot of back and forth on that. So I think the lens tends to shift if Senna was still alive. Because think about it. We talk about Fangio and how great Fangio was, but Fangio lived a good long life and then he passed away. There's other drivers that have lived good long lives and have passed away. When Nigel Mansell eventually leaves us, are we going to go back and have the same reverence for Nigel Mansell? I mean, maybe we're going to have it for his mustache.
Yeah.
We're not going to have that for him in the same way we do for Senna.
That's the thing, he passes away. So, I mean, anything after that is all conjecture, because you don't know.
It's like this comic book he had where he joins Ferrari in 1995, and there's a picture of him driving for Ferrari in 1995.
Could have only wished.
Well, that's the, kind of what I wanted to throw out there was, that's what the talk was, is the only reason he didn't go to Ferrari in 94 was because they had contracts with the two guys at the time with, what's her name? So, and he had talks, hey, everyone always wants to drive Ferrari. And I think it was getting up there in age. Even back in that time, though, is when you were in your mid-30s, you were basically still in your prime. It's not like this day and age where, you're over the hill now. The interesting question would be okay, stay in 95, even if it was 96, he goes, I'm going to go to Ferrari because I want to finish up my career at Ferrari because I want to see. Schumacher wouldn't have gone.
Right.
Talk about changing history completely, because you wouldn't have gone there if Senna was there.
That's right.
That would have been kind of an interesting scenario. But again, it's all conjecture. It's all
speculation.
You make up whatever you want because you'll never know. What if Senna won more championships? You don't know, because, again, it's a scenario where the car was playing such a more major role in regards to if you won the championship.
Well, and the cars changed so much, didn't they? After Senna was killed, the cars changed so dramatically, that the whole parameters were different.
And what marred it for me and Prost, because of growing up through the rivalry, all that stuff. I mean, and a lot of listeners may or may not know Prost and Senna were teammates at one point, and they still couldn't stand each other, all that stuff. But
no, they were friends at first. They were friends at the beginning of 1988, and there was respect. And you'll see interviews between them. And then there's that interview at the British Grand Prix where Prost says, Ayrton has a tiny problem. He thinks he can't kill himself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
You can see Senna sitting there thinking, "You're just a French, got no balls." Yeah, you can you can see that, and the tension. There's later into the film does a really good job at showing those kind of.
You're talking about the Senna documentary, right? You keep bringing
The Senna documentary, the Asif Kapadia documentary, yeah, which when you watch now, it doesn't seem that revolutionary, but back when that film was made, not only did that make Senna come alive, but that really changed. Arguably, there would have been no Drive to Survive without that Senna documentary. That Senna documentary was really pivotal. And Asif Kapadia was not a Formula One fan. He was somebody who saw who Senna was, who saw this compelling story, and then who was able to dig deep with the resources, get Bernie Ecclestone's private film. So that what you had was something that my wife watched. Gosh, these baddie Frenchmen trying to outmaneuver our hero. Whilst I was being like, I can't believe we're in the briefing room at Suzuka and Piquet is standing up for Senna.
Yeah.
The storytelling, and of course that's something that Eric, you and I have talked about a lot, that, arguably some of Senna's greatness is predicated in the fact that Kapadia made this compelling story about him.
Right.
Without the life of St. Patrick, we don't know anything about St. Patrick.
He drove the snakes out of Ireland, right?
He did. He was the first person to see the Loch Ness Monster, apparently.
But the thing about Prost, what really kind of put the thumb on there and sort of marred the lens for me, and I will admit, I grew up with the idea that Prost was the villain. And watching the Cartier film, there's some things I read into even the funeral scene, and is he really guilty, and blah 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 and all this kind of stuff. You and I have debated that back and forth several times, but it's what came later. I look at what he's saying now and think about what happened after in the 90s and the 2000s when he stepped up as the professor and he bought Jordan Peugeot and turned it into Prost Racing. And what happened? Nothing. Garbage. It was trash. And there was a tragic accident with Olivier Panis. It was terrible.
But that's the story of Graham Hill. That's the story of John Surtees. It's hard to go from one to the other. The people that, we're talking about the greatest ever. Jack Brabham has to be in with a shout. The bloody bloke built his own car. He came from Australia, built his own car, and beat everybody in Europe. I mean, god damn. He started out front engine cars in the late 50s, driving, then partners with John Cooper, first rear engine world champion, then aero wide tires 1970. Right. He's still nearly champion in 1970. If he hadn't have run out of gas and pushed the car home at Monaco and run out of gas on the last lap whilst he was leading at the British Grand Prix, he would have been world champion in 1970, not Jochen Rindt. I don't know how you quantifying the greatness is hard.
So what I'm getting at is, in this case, because you're on the big stage, it's Formula One, you're in the global eye, there's good and bad press. And these days it's mitigated differently than it was back then. So if you look at the 90s and early 2000s, and that's why I was saying we got to stretch the lens of this from the 80s to the early 2000s, for every failure that Prost inherited with his racing team, the former Jordan F1 Peugeot team, this all French team, French drivers, and this whole campaign that he had, it was this like over exuberant arrogance that I can't define. And it just irks me to no end. But for every one of those failures, it negates his wins. And so it brings him down the ladder when you talk about greatness.
Well, does it? Do all those years, do those Mercedes years negate Michael's utter dominance in those Ferrari years? Did they negate the way Michael crafted the sport in his own image?
It's a black eye on Schumacher's resume. And if he hadn't come back and run at Mercedes after being done at Ferrari, he would have left on a high note.
He would be greater.
Yeah. But he's not. He has these like 2 seasons with Mercedes that just suck. And the same is true of Prost. It's like, had you just left it alone, you would have been better off. But it's that tragic Greek story of Hermes flying too close to the sun and the wings melt off his shoes. And it's all this hubris. And Formula One is full of that. And to Senna's credit, we saw the bravado. We saw, yes, this animal instinct, the aggression, his greatness. I hate to say it this way. He died on a high note. And so there was never a negative if you discount, his personality, whether you liked it or not, and if he was a bully and these kinds of things. There's not a lot of things in the con column where Prost comes to the table and says, I'm so good, I'm going to start my own team. And it was terrible.
Well, and he took a long time to be world champion as well. He fucked around a lot with Renault, didn't he?
Yeah.
I mean, and let's not beat around the bush. Jabouille, Arnoux, and Tombay, could they beat me? Yeah. Could they beat all three of us? Yeah, probably. Are they in anybody's top 10 or top 20 Formula One drivers, whoever,
No.
sat in a car? No. So the competition that he was facing coming up through the French ranks, just wasn't that much, was it? That's the car, that Renault, those Renaults, you get the sense that when they worked, you could win with them, but they always caught on fire or blew up or, shit the bed somehow in the race, didn't they? They were never, so it was hard to tell his talent because the car was such a bloody disaster. I mean, you can argue the same with Piquet, right? In those years with the Brabham BMW. But again, if you compare him with Piquet, who would I have put in the car? Who would I prefer in the car, Prost or Piquet? Ask me what year it is, because early on I'd take Piquet, and later on I'd take Prost. I was going to say, right, when we talk about the greatness, I feel it's narrowing it down too much to say only the people from that era. Just like Maldonado and Buck Baker, I feel like you can make comparisons. And I feel like Fangio has the status he has because the guy has a 46% wins to starts ratio.
Right.
And I just need you to really stop and think about that in an era when the cars weren't that reliable. And like everybody else, for a minute there, he was unknown and was the unknown foreign Johnny who was given the crap car that made up the numbers at the back of the grid. 46% win ratio. He also wasn't world champion until he was 40. And then he was world champion 4 times back to back. Once, then had a big accident, recovered from the big accident, then just back to back. And you might say, well, he was always in the best car. Well, yeah, that was because everyone knew he was the best driver. So he just went wherever the best car was. Again, wouldn't you do that? When we're considering his greatness, Doug Nye, the British historian, once asked Sterling Moss, he said to Moss, when it would, with the two of you compare setup, and Moss said, I would go out and do all the testing. And then Fangio would always say, I'll have whatever Moss is having, because after the first couple of races, he trusted me. And Doug Nye said to him, well, Sterling, did you never try to trick the old man? And Moss was like, yeah, once at Dundrod, I went back to the engineers afterwards and said, actually change my back axle ratio. So I beat Fangio fair and squarely at that event. And afterwards, I never wanted to do that again. I never wanted to cheat like that again. But think about Fangio then. I just take whatever. I would just make the most of whatever you're giving me. This is unlike Senna than what you need in the 80s, where you go back and you change the car and you do this and you do that. You don't just drive the car until it's all used up in the 1950s. And so this is why Fangio has the status that he has. I would say, Ferrari's greatest ever is Tazio Nuvolari.
Mm-hmm.
And I with Nuvolari because of the descriptions you get of speed, the gap between him and everybody else, whether it's Ferrari talking about the way he took corners, or whether it's lap times, or whether it's that first newspaper mention of an audacious young man. Everywhere you read, when you read about comparisons between Varzi and Nuvolari, it's stories of Varzi's smoothness and Nuvolari's aggression. If greatness lies in how it happens, as we've been talking about with Senna, it's not how many races you won, it's the way in which you did it, it's the manner in which you did it, it's the style. I feel for passion and greatness, you can't equal Nuvolari.
I mean, we're going to have to let William probably settle this debate, because you and I are never going to agree. But, we'll get William's input on this. You hit on something almost by accident, and it triggered something in my mind, because I realized maybe this discussion shouldn't be about the greatest of all time. Maybe there is no such thing, right? Maybe we shouldn't be trying to single out one person. And what I mean by that is Fangio, Nuvolari, Schumacher, Senna, Prost, Mansell, you name it, pick your favorite. They're heroes. And if you think about it, in that construct, now we're having this depending on which camp you're in. Is it DC Comics or is it Marvel Comics? Who's better? Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, so on down the line. They're all great in their own respective ways. And together, in period, they're unstoppable. This just Justice League of racers. And if you think about it, though, you have to layer it that way. Fangio didn't run in the same era as Senna in the same way. If you think about it from a comic book perspective, the early DC characters, the Green Lantern with the tin hat versus, the guy in the super suit that we saw in the 80s and 90s, they're still Green Lanterns. We'll use that analogy, but they're not of the same era. So you have to do Fangio and Mas and all the guys from, the Mille Miglia that we talked about on those episodes, and you have to look at them as heroes of that era. Now, if we want to get specific, who was the best of the best in that 20-year period? So be it. So the question now becomes, do we really want to put Senna up there by himself, or do we want to elevate other names? Because now you can bring in Andretti's and Unsers and Moutons and Stucks and Haywoods and Sullivans. The list goes on of other heroes, maybe from other disciplines, that can stand shoulder to shoulder with Senna in this glorious IROC race in the sky, right? So, William, where are we with this? Should we continue down the path of greatest of all time, or should we think about it more in the context of heroes?
You have to kind of wonder in regards, like I said, obviously, Senna up on a pedestal. The time frame that he raced, so you have all these young kids that were into motorsports, whatnot. They grow up to start racing, so they idolize Senna because that's what they watched before they started racing. So then you got Lewis Hamilton, like that, say, Senna's my idol, Senna's my idol. So then you got this other younger generation watching Hamilton, emulating, but then they have, these guys that racing F1 that say the emulates, oh, I love Senna, Senna's my hero, So you have this, I want to be like Lewis Hamilton, so, I love Senna. Is that perpetuating his story, his status, whatnot? Because people just keep pushing. You have these very high profile individuals in that sport emulate, say, oh, Senna was the best, or hey, I love Senna. So they have the other people want to, hey, I'm emulating them. So, hey, Senna's the greatest, of all time, blah, blah, blah. I always break down discipline. You can never have that saying, oh, the greatest of all time. Greatest of all time, say, in that period, in F1, okay. It's Senna, hands down. You look at how he did it, what he was able to do, in the different cars, especially in wet weather, everything like that. But if you open that up to about just pure drivers, you got to look at, like you said, the Andretti's, the Foyts. We go back, look at Clark, Fangio, Moss. The guys that could, especially then, is those guys to make a living had to race everything and anything they could, get behind the wheel to earn and support themselves and their family. You didn't have that day and age, starting in the 80s, these guys, their contracts could all of a sudden be starting, hey, all I need to race is F1 because the money I'm making in it and blah, 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 that's all I got to do. It just got exorbitant, just going up, like John was saying, that, his last, says last year at McLaren, that race contract, he was getting $1 million a race.
Yeah.
$16 million for the year. I mean, and everyone was like, oh my God, that's absurd. This and that. But look what he did.
Oh, and it was all just point scoring with Ron Dennis anyway. It wasn't, he didn't need the money. Neither. They just did. No. I mean, if you look at interviews with Ron Dennis afterwards, it was just like they just needed to have that process because that's how both of them were, and that was how their relationship had been. I do think it's too much of a cop-out to say, oh, you can't compare across different eras and so on. To me, no sports car driver is as great as the greatest Formula One driver because Formula One's harder than sports cars. Formula One's got better people in it than sports cars. I love NASCAR, but, driving a car with a roll cage around an oval is not as difficult as driving a Formula One car.
But is Formula One as difficult as running the 24 hours of Le Mans? Because that's a whole nother level. And the Indy 500 is a whole nother level of risk.
And the argument now, and what Indy is now versus what Indy was in the 50s and 60s, is that the Indianapolis that Jim Clark, Jackie Stewart, the other Englishmen and Scotsmen who came, what they found, that was a much, much bigger. I mean, Jim Clark, when he won Indianapolis 500, won more money in that single event than he'd won his whole Formula One career up to then. And if you go to the Jim Clark Museum, there's like all of his Formula One trophies, and then there's like a whole separate cabinet for his Indianapolis 500 trophy. It was so the proportions, the relative importance of the different events changes, I think, as well. I just feel like fundamentally greatness is something that you don't need. You either have it or you don't. It's either there or it isn't. You don't need to be a soccer fan to see Pele's genius. I'm not a soccer fan. I didn't even know who Messi was until my son explained to me the other day. But, I know Pele, and I've seen Pele do that overhead kick into the goal. I put it to you, Senna's pass on the Craner curves in the 1993 Donington Grand Prix, that whole brooding, compelling manner that he has. In 1,000 years' time, when they say, well, what is a racing driver? What did a racing driver look like? I just feel like it's more likely to be Ayrton Senna than Alain Prost.
It's the basketball analogy, right? When you talk about the greatest basketball player or most recognizable, there's certain icons, right? And I think that's where we need to make the difference is that, okay, if we're not going to do the hero thing, and we're not going to put Senna as the greatest of all time, then he's an icon, much like Michael Jordan is an icon. And a fun fact, just bringing the comic books back into the situation, apparently you can go to the middle of nowhere of the Congo and show people the bat symbol, and everybody knows who Batman is, right? It's an icon. And I think Senna, that's where we've transcended. He's an icon, maybe not the GOAT anymore because Lewis Hamilton statistically is better. Max Verstappen can drive harder than Senna ever did. Michael Schumacher and his records.
But on these Tilke circuits, it's like Senna versus Nuvolari. Senna drove a much harder car than Nuvolari did, but Nuvolari did like the Mille Miglia and the Targa Florio and the Nürburgring in the rain. This is far more epic. This is a much greater stage than Senna had. These modern Tilke circuits, this whole persona that Lewis Hamilton has now, this is not greatness in the sense that the sport used to be. Nobody deserves to be a knight more than a knight of the realm, a sir, right, than Lewis Hamilton for, going abroad and doing great things and reflecting well on England and British people, right? He fully deserves that. But the sport at the moment doesn't have the epic qualities it had in the Senna period. The epicness ended with Senna, and Schumi's, deliberate crashing and deliberate spoiling of Alonso's pole lap at, Monaco in 2006, this kind of behavior. Yes, we saw it in Senna, that kind of what William called earlier bullying behavior, and in Schumacher, it's come along more and more, and now everybody does it, and it's just part of the sport. The sport is less for that. The sport of Nuvolari was mountain climbing and bullfighting. The sport of Verstappen is, tiddlywinks and Messi falling over, pretending he's hurt his leg to get a yellow card, right? It's the sport isn't as epic as it was. Therefore, it doesn't matter to me how many pole positions or wins or championships, right, a Jimmy Johnson or a Lewis Hamilton wins. Those are not the same as the championships that David Pearson or Ayrton Senna or Juan Manuel Fangio won.
I think what you can say it could boil down to is any genre, any discipline of racing. You have the guys that can go 8/10. Then you got the smaller minute that can go 9/10. You have that very rarefied few, and which Ayrton Senna was, that could drive that car to 10/10 lap after lap. And I think that can kind of define how well or heroic or iconic someone is. There were very, very few that could do that and drive that car to 10/10, especially back then, to drive one of those cars at 10/10. This day and age, there's so many nanny aids and all this stuff. And so getting there, it's not really the same. But back then, to have the cojones for one, but the talent to be able to drive that car, that in any car and basically any weather, I just showcased what his skill and his talent was. He was able to squeeze it out of that car.
John knows the answer is Group B rally. That's the answer to everything.
Yeah, but you see that is in the greatest ever. Surely you have to throw Sebastian Loeb in there. Yeah. If you're talking about the greatest ever, because even if you say, well, rally cars aren't as slow and it's only one discipline and, it's the modern era where generally speaking, when people are dominant, they're dominant for what, Keke Rosberg was champion 1 year.
Yeah.
Vettel was champion 4 years. Arguably, the skill gap between them and their peers was no more or less. It was just the sport was different. So Vettel's dominance looks, so even if you argued that rallying falls a low sheer level of dominance, is compelling.
Yeah.
I bring up rally only because William was talking about multiple discipline. And the reason I bring it up is if you look at it in our lens in period, the greatest racing at that time, hands down, even though Senna was doing miraculous things with the McLaren, Group B rally was far and above the best racing that you could watch in period. More so than F1. I'll make that argument all day long. And there's plenty of facts and figures to back that up too. But, again, it's all about these boxes and how we look at things and the perspective we're coming at. So,
yeah, because you couldn't see it. It wasn't televised. Like World Rally wasn't televised, was it? You couldn't see anything.
You could in the States. We had to pay a lot of money to see it.
Yeah, I mean, on my BBC subscription, you didn't see you didn't see any of it. I don't know. Maybe in order to be great, do you need to be seen by a lot of people? Is Marco Alain's greatness hidden under a bushel because nobody was watching rallying? Nobody saw him. Because that's the thing with it. Even those, because at least Formula One, one of the ways of spotting Senna's greatness is the car is so visibly on the ragged edge in comparison to everybody else. And that Capadia film does a really good job of showing that. But if nobody's filming the rallying, how can we can't even see that, and as a spectacle, Formula One, the cars are there, you watch them all go around, the cameras are there. Rallying's hard. You're standing on a mountain hillside and the car comes past, and then 5 minutes goes by and another one comes past. How great can that spectacle really be?
It's better now than it was then, that's for sure. There was a lot of helicopter footage back in the 80s for rally.
That was the thing, wasn't it? That the chase helicopters were part of the whole over budgeting danger of Group B rally.
Well, we'll put a pin in that because we're going to come back to that at another point. Not in this episode, at another point, maybe this season. So, John, we've talked a lot about Senna. We've talked about his greatness. We've talked about his life, his triumphs, his tribulations, and everything else. How do we bring this home? How do you want to conclude this tribute to Senna now 30 years after his passing?
Yeah. When you approached me to talk about this, I thought, well, it is 30 years, should sort of have some kind of a conversation. And then my next thought is, well, do I really want to go over this ground again? Because I feel like, I did do that work in 2014 where I went and visited and saw this peculiar beatification and stayed in the hotel where he spent his last night and visited his hotel room and all of this kind of really quite
morbid.
Yeah, well, morbid, but just odd, just really peculiar, and that was really what set me thinking about what's happening to this guy who used to just be a racing driver who I liked and is now turning into something else. And I'm reminded of, there was a Roman emperor, Vespasian, who supposedly, when a Roman emperor would die, they would always be deified. The Romans would always turn their old emperors into gods who you could pray to. So the joke is that Vespasian, supposedly his final words were, "Oh God, I think I'm becoming a god." So there was a sense of that sort of transition happening, right? There's a sense of that. So I suppose, so how should we remember him? How do I want to wrap this up? Maybe a good way to wrap it up is simply to say, we've said how hard it is to compare across eras. We've said how it's all subjective from the point of view that, that you're looking at it from. Maybe the way to wrap it up is to say that greatness is mostly to do with us being middle-aged and looking back to a time when we were young. We're looking back to our own lost youth. Right, that Senna was the great guy when we were young. Therefore, we, in our greatest moment, therefore we feel like he was the greatest ever. Therefore, instinctively, we struggle. We feel like we find ways of comparing Lewis Hamilton and Sebastian Vettel and Michael Schumacher with Senna that make him feel less advantageous because it's our own youth that we're looking back to. And it's that own feeling of, wowee, this is magical and spectacular and awesome. And this guy's reaching out of the TV and touching me in suburban England in summer 1985.
William, I think he just defined nostalgia, didn't he?
Sounds like it, just a little bit.
Yeah, just a little bit.
This is just a way to date all three of us.
Way to make us feel old, John.
Yeah, Jesus.
Yeah, well, so what that means, right, is that this exercise you need to carry on, right? There needs to be a Senna at 40 years and Senna at 50 years. And, because there'll be that sense like's happening with 57 Chevys at the moment, that the people who collected them are all dying off. So they're declining in value. Their greatness is declining because there's nobody who remembers their greatness to buy them and prop up values anymore.
I think my parting thought on this is looking back over the 60 years of Senna, if you think about his 30 years on this earth and 30 years since he's been gone, like I said at the beginning, he has touched our lives, and our is the global our, the motorsports community, the petrol heads that are out there. If you're learning about Senna for the first time today, which I don't know where you've been this entire time, but in my formidable early years, Senna was part of what made me a motorsports enthusiast. And so I just want to say thank you, because if it wasn't for Ayrton Senna, I don't think I'd be invested in motorsport as much as I am. Now, that's not to say I don't have respect for Michel Mouton and Hans Stuck and all these other people that I hold in high regard. But Senna is sort of like Zeus on Mount Olympus. He's the god amongst the gods. And so it's hard for me to break that illusion because it was cemented. I imprinted on that at a very, very early age. I mean, I'm younger than both of you guys, and I'm not trying to make you feel even older. Those first impressions, as they say, are lasting impressions. So when I look back over Senna's time before and after, all I can say is thank you.
Yeah. He is motorsport.
Yeah.
He was like that for me. As an Englishman, you should have been a Nigel Mansell fan, but you weren't. It was, or I wasn't. It was all about Senna. And what I called charisma, Eric, you've framed it into being something larger than that. It's this almost a lens for understanding motorsport altogether.
Yeah, and I don't think, people that are probably huge fans of him understand or realize it. Yeah, he had this persona on the track, obviously whatever it takes to win, doing what he has to do. I think that kind of changed how the attitude of drivers that came after, saying, okay, I got it. Like with Schumacher, hey, if you want to win championships, this is what you have to do to go forward. So I think he really changed the sport in regards to future drivers and what they had to do if they wanted to be successful and reach the pinnacle and then be at that level to do it. It's like, you got to do what it takes to win. Hey, you just got to have that mentality. F it, I got to go after it and go get it. The other side, though, is, and to this day, I don't think people understand or know, or probably a lot too, is his off-track persona. I don't think people realize how many millions of dollars he raised and donates to this day every year to his foundation to the underprivileged in Brazil. If you look at what he's done post-mortem, it's incredible. He did something positive with what he was able to achieve, which speaks volumes about the type of person he was. And, he was a huge, very, very religious guy. Talking about Prost, comedy things, he doesn't think he can die or because he's got something with God or he's got a God complex. It was an interesting character, but I think he just kind of set the precedent for future racing and future drivers for what it would take to be at that level and do it. And you look at these guys, hey, it's me. You don't talk to your teammate, whatnot. It's like, hey, you just got to have that mentality. I got to do it. And look how Verstappen was. I mean, from day one, when he was 4 or 5 years old, when he first got a kart, his dad was relentless and brutal on him in regards to practice and just driving, what it takes to be world champion. And look, that's what he knew and did. And look at him now. He's paying off. So in 20 years, young kids that are growing up karting now, emulating Max Verstappen, it's just, that's what people just all of a sudden, that's what I have to be. If I want to be world champion in Formula One, I got to be like that. I got to be like Senna. I got to be like Schumacher. I got to be like Verstappen. It's like, you got to have that singular focus. And, like I said before, for what he was able to do in a car, going on YouTube and just watching what he could do. It's just unbelievable what he could do in a car at that speed, doing all the multiple things, it's incredible. It's incredible. And it would have been fabulous if he hadn't passed away, just to see what he could have done subsequent years after that, because he still had a good another 6-7 years in him easily. It would have changed up how the sport played out in the following years. And I think it would have been able to put to bed in regards to his legacy, in regards to where he would have stood. Because if he would have cemented it in regards to 2 or 3 more championships, more wins, everything like that, it really would have solidified it. everyone's always going to have the argument. Well, he only won the 3 and it's not, but you don't know what he would have done, but he was the man. That's all you got really saying.
The spiritualism is something we didn't really touch on very much. And, my personal sense is that he felt as if God was communicating through him. We talked about Monaco in 1988 when he crashed into the barriers there. At least in the Capadia movie, when Capadia has him talking in an interview, the feeling that you get from him is that God was speaking through him. And I used to feel, European kings in the medieval period felt they had a divine right to rule. God had put them on earth to be king. So that gave them the right to tell everybody else what to do because God had made them king. And I've always felt like Senna had a sort of divine right to pass, that he would place the car in such a way that, it was up to the other guy whether or not you had an accident. That way of being, again, everybody's like that in Formula One now. Nobody was like that before Senna came along. And you can argue that made the sport worse, but that was the winningness and part of the greatness. The persona away from the track, the charitable work, this sort of little persona that he had, Senina, which is a sort of little like cartoon character version of himself that was involved with a lot of those kind of charitable projects. I feel like I want to talk to Brazilians about that element of who he is, because obviously that's very different from the way that Piquet was. And I feel like for Brazilians, a lot of Senna's greatness lies in the fact that he was so proud of being Brazilian. And something that I've written in the past is I feel like a lot of the British public's affection for Stirling Moss was based on the fact that, in post-war England, there was still rationing. So people were poor and didn't have a lot of food and didn't have a lot of excitement, and life was a bit crap. And here was this Englishman who was going abroad and racing cars and winning, and it reminded you of winning foreign victories in the war. And he was young and handsome and smiling, and it was exciting. And I witnessed that, in my parents' peer group, if you like, that they all have this warm feeling towards Moss. And I feel like I would like to understand more about, from a Brazilian perspective, but I do feel like my sense is Senna had that kind of thing going on. That's his greatness as a man. None of that has any reflection on his greatness or otherwise as a racing driver or as a Formula One driver.
We'll just ask Rubens Barrichello, the second coming, right?
Yeah.
Well, we'll leave that where it is. I guess, John, it's time to kind of close this thing up. Why don't you take us home?
It is time to, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, Eric, for steering me through my rambling and disjointed thoughts here. Thank you very much, William, for being on board here and offering your Ferrari-focused and Porsche-focused perspectives here. Yeah, thanks to you both, and we'll see you next time.
This episode has been brought to you by Grand Touring Motorsports as part of our Motoring Podcast Network. For more episodes like this, tune in each week for more exciting and educational content from organizations like the Exotic Car Marketplace, the Motoring Historian, Break Fix, and many others. If you'd like to support Grand Touring Motorsports and the Motoring Podcast Network, sign up for one of our many sponsorship tiers at www.patreon.com/GT Motorsports. Please note that the content, opinions, and materials presented and expressed in this episode are those of its creator, and this episode has been published with their consent. If you have any inquiries about this program, please contact the creators of this episode via email or social media as mentioned in the episode.